For decades, Palestinian families in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem have been engaged in a legal battle in the Israeli courts against Jewish settlers who are trying to kick them out of their homes. In anticipation of the Israeli Supreme Court's ruling to evict them, the families protested in the neighborhood. They were attacked by Jewish right-wing protesters. The next day, May 7th, Israeli police stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, third holiest site in Islam, attacking worshippers and first responders. This is an official police video, so you only see one side, but you'll see the police, there they are at the end. On May 10th, the Hamas issued an ultimatum to Israel that they would attack if Israeli forces did not leave the Temple Mount and Sheikh Jarrah by 6 p.m. Israel ignored the ultimatum, so Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fired rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel. Israel launched airstrikes on Gaza the same day. Within Israel, occupied Palestine, that is, violent clashes erupted between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. Now, these are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, unlike the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. This is an unprecedented conflict between Israeli Arabs, as they're sometimes referred to in Israel, and Israeli Jews. The mayor of the city of Lod, which is a so-called mixed city, described this as a civil war. So far, over 240 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli army in Gaza. Palestinian rockets have killed 12 people in Israel. The Hamas has agreed to a ceasefire since May 13th, but Israel refused to stop the attacks. A ceasefire was finally declared last Friday, May 21st, after enormous international pressure. Here we see the gradual takeover of Arab Palestinian land by the Zionist occupation from 1947, just before the establishment of the Zionist state of Israel, to the present day. So how did we get here? Palestine did not have precise borders before the British and French carved up the region. But since the ancient Greeks, at least, the word Palestine was used to refer roughly to the red area in the center of this map, sometimes including what is now Syria, connecting Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. The name Palestine derives from the Philistine people who arrived in the region in the 12th century BC around the same time as the Israelites, who later branched into the Jewish people. We don't know of any connection of descendants between the Philistines and Palestinian Arabs besides the connection of the name. And Palestine had a Jewish majority from roughly the Greek period until 3rd to 5th century. Then this shifted to a Christian majority in the Byzantine area, and then a Muslim majority. Zionists refer to this Jewish majority of antiquity to argue that Palestine was home to the Jewish people until they were expelled by various empires, especially the Roman Empire. According to this myth, despite 2,000 years of diaspora and persecution, the tenacious Jews maintained their identity and religion. They were persecuted, the Zionists say, because they were a religious minority without a state of their own. And what better choice for a Jewish state than the historic origin of the Jewish people? So Zionism is presented as a return to the homeland and a solution to anti-Semitism. On the other side, we frequently hear from the anti-Zionist camp that the Jews of today are actually descended from converts from the Middle Ages. Therefore, we're told they don't have historical rights to Palestine. As usual with mainstream political debates, both sides are wrong. There were significant expulsions of many people, including the Jews, by the ancient empires, and the conversion theories have no real evidence. However, several centuries before the fall of Jerusalem by Roman conquest, the majority of Jews were already spread over Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. For the dispersed Jews in the Greek and Roman empires, Palestine was never a homeland. It was a holy site similar to that of Mecca for Muslims today. The real cause of the Jewish diaspora was not expulsion, but that the majority of Jews were engaged in trade. This is also the cause of anti-Semitism, the hatred towards merchants in agricultural societies. Another example of this type of racism is that against the Armenians. Not coincidentally, the Armenians suffered their Holocaust by the Ottomans during World War I. The Jewish diaspora or dispersion is the key to the persistence of the Jewish people for 2,000 years. They performed an important economic function as merchants in pre-capitalist economies. As Jewish Belgian revolutionary Abraham Leon wrote shortly before being sent to Auschwitz, if the Jews had been preserved, it was not despite their dispersion, but because of it. If the Jews had remained in Palestine, there's no reason to believe that their fate would have been any different from that of the other nations of antiquity. The growth of capitalism in Europe from the 11th century onwards pushed the Jews out of commerce increasingly into usury and land ownership, which exacerbated anti-Semitism. When even these distinct economic functions became obsolete, the Jews were exiled country after country from Western Europe, and their population shifted to the east. The late development of capitalism in the Russian Empire, that is in Eastern Europe, brought about the economic downfall of these Eastern European Jews in the 19th century. They were reduced to poor, isolated communities with high unemployment rates. In the late 19th century, as the socialist movement swept across Europe, the Jews were scapegoated by the ruling classes, and there was a sharp rise in anti-Semitism. Many bloody pogroms, massacres, were carried out against Jewish communities in the Russian Empire. Some of the most violent ones were in response to the 1905 Russian Revolution. 5 million Jews fled Eastern Europe to Western Europe and the United States. The upsurge of anti-Semitism in Europe brought about two political responses among Jews: Zionism and socialism. From the late 19th century until the rise of fascism, the majority of politically active Jews were socialists who understood that anti-Semitism is a side effect of class conflict and that Jews can only be free when the working class is free. Zionism was a form of nationalism that called for a Jewish state, and it was a fringe phenomenon. Of the 5 million Jews who escaped the pogroms, only a few thousand Jews emigrated to Palestine. This just shows you how unpopular Zionism was. In a very anti-Semitic article, Winston Churchill wrote, as late as 1920, the struggle between the Zionist and Bolshevik Jews is little less than a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. The Austrian Jewish journalist Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, or father of modern Zionism, began to actively organize for the Zionist cause, the establishment of a Jewish state. He understood that if Jews were to colonize Palestine, they'd have to guarantee the support of the major capitalist powers of Western Europe. In his manifesto, The Jewish State, he wrote, "For Europe, we would form there part of the rampart against Asia, serving as an outpost of civilization against barbarism. As a neutral state, we would remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence." In his diary, he wrote, "We must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit or transfer the poor population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it any employment in our country. The property owners will come over to our side." This foreshadowed a major aspect of the colonization of Palestine that was to come. Unlike South Africa, that was occupied by a minority of Europeans who exploited the labor of the indigenous Africans, the Jewish state in Palestine, that would be named Israel, would rely on ethnic cleansing, that is, getting rid of the Palestinians as much as possible, so as to minimize Zionist reliance on Arab labor. The founders of Israel aimed to make it a Jewish capitalist society with a Jewish working class and, of course, Jewish ruling class. Also, as Herzl predicted, Zionists relied on the existing class structure in Ottoman Palestine to kick farmers off their land simply by buying it from the landowners, at least in the early stages. Later, they used more violent means. To this day, this is a popular Zionist talking point. We just bought the land legally, they say. So yes, you can take advantage of an existing mode of exploitation to make it much worse by legal means. The First World War ended with the victory of the French and British capitalists, who divided the defeated Ottoman Empire between them. Syria and Lebanon went to France, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine to Britain. The main resource at stake was Middle Eastern oil, which was fast becoming the main fuel of capitalism. The British declared support for Zionism in the famous Balfour Declaration of 1917, a letter from the British Lord Balfour to the Jewish banker Rothschild, who was one of the big benefactors of Zionism. From 1922 to 35, the Jewish population in Palestine rose from 9 to 27% of the population, displacing tens of thousands of Palestinians through land purchase. Facing the threat of working class revolution, the European capitalists helped fascist dictators like Mussolini and Hitler into power in the 20s and 30s, who then crushed the socialist movement. This defeat of the working class tipped the scale of Jewish support from socialism to Zionism. Jewish activists who stayed in Europe to fight for socialism died in the Nazi Holocaust. Zionism offered the pragmatic Plan B after the defeat of socialism. 250,000 Jews escaped the Holocaust by emigrating to Palestine when other countries closed their borders to Jewish immigration. This, too, is an historical fact that Jews in Israel to this day are very attached to and cite as a justification for Zionism. If it wasn't for Zionism, they say, we would have died in Hitler's camps. In this graph, we see the sharp rise of Jewish immigration to Palestine after Hitler came to power in 1933. In 1929, Palestinians organized protests against the British occupation and Zionist takeover of their lands. The British army brutally suppressed them. In the 1930s, Palestinians formed militias and turned increasingly to armed struggle. Zionist and Palestinian militias clashed repeatedly between themselves and the British. In 1936, Arab dock workers in Jaffa went on strike. This quickly expanded to a general strike, demanding an end to Jewish immigration and British occupation. The strike lasted for 6 months and was put down violently by the British and Zionist forces. After the strike, an armed rebellion of Palestinian farmers broke out in 1937, and it took the British much longer to put down. It didn't help that the Palestinian Communist Party, which had been established in 1924, had transformed by 1936 into an instrument of Stalin's foreign policy, just like the other communist parties around the world. This meant prioritizing alliances with the Arab ruling elites instead of organizing for workers' power. The Palestinian Communist Party supported the nationalist Arab leaders, who then made compromises with the British and weakened the revolt. In 1940, Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky wrote, "The attempt to solve the Jewish question through the migration of Jews to Palestine can now be seen for what it is, a tragic mockery of the Jewish people. Never was it so clear as it is today that the salvation of the Jewish people is bound up inseparably with the overthrow of the capitalist system." After the Second World War, the US emerged as the new capitalist superpower instead of Britain, competing with the Soviet Union over domination of the Middle East. In November 1947, the Soviet Union supported the United Nations partition plan for Palestine, which effectively sanctioned the creation of a Zionist state. The United States bullied many states to vote in favor of it. The partition allotted 56% of the land to the Jews, even though they were only 32% of the population. The support of the USSR dealt the final blow to what remained of the Palestinian Communist Party. In May 1948, the Zionist leaders announced the establishment of their state and elected to name it Israel. The UN partition sparked the Arab-Israeli War, a conflict between Jewish paramilitary groups, which later became the Israeli army, the IDF, and the Palestinian resistance fighters, drew in the neighboring Arab countries of Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. The support of the Soviet Union under Stalin was crucial in the Zionist victory, as Israel acquired weapons from Czechoslovakia, which was a satellite of the USSR. During the war, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their cities and villages and became refugees in Jordan, Egypt, and Syria. Many Palestinians fled their homes in terror, following massacres conducted by Zionist militias, most infamously in the village of Deir Yassin. This mass expulsion is known as the Nakba, or catastrophe. The word is also used more broadly for the continuing ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians to this day. When the war ended, the Zionist control of Palestine increased by 22% compared to the UN partition, and the new state of Israel came to control 77% of Palestine. The mass expulsion of Palestinians set back the resistance movement for years. In the 1950s, Israel shifted its alliance from Britain to France, which was fighting a colonial war in Algeria. Gamal Abdel Nasser rose to power in Egypt and led a growing Arab nationalist movement that threatened to weaken the control of the capitalist powers over North Africa and the Middle East. Britain and France wanted to get rid of him right away, but the US was more hesitant at first, as they were fighting a Cold War with the USSR and wanted Nasser's nationalist movement to destroy the Arab communist parties, especially those of Syria and Iraq, which had grown to the point of threatening the pro-US regimes there. This aim was achieved. In the late 50s and early 60s, the communist parties were crushed by the nationalists, and the US was then ready to turn against Nasser. In 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which would severely cut profits from the Western capitalists. Israel attacked Egypt, and in return, France supplied Israel with a nuclear reactor, weapons, and fighter jets. During Israel's invasion of the Gaza Strip, Israeli soldiers committed the Khan Yunis and Rafah massacres, killing hundreds of unarmed Palestinians. The goal of overthrowing Nasser, however, had not yet been achieved. In 1958, the Palestinian organization Fatah was founded and led by Yasser Arafat. It advocated guerrilla warfare against Zionist occupation. In 1964, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was established. It would incorporate Fatah as its largest faction a few years later. In 1966, the US provided $90 million in military aid to Israel and approved of its 1967 attack on Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, the so-called Six-Day War, in order to stop Nasser. This war allowed Israel to capture the remainder of Palestine, the Golan Heights from Syria in the north, the Gaza Strip and Sinai from Egypt, and the West Bank from Jordan. Nasser resigned after this humiliating defeat. The conquering of the West Bank was grounds for further Zionist colonization. Israel has been building settlements in the West Bank ever since and has taken over most of the water and the best agricultural land from the Palestinians. The 67 war was followed by a series of skirmishes between Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, and the PLO, known as the War of Attrition. The Fatah guerrilla fighters were able to stave off Israeli military forces in the Battle of Karama in Jordan, which inspired many Palestinians and saw the growth of Fatah. The weakness of Fatah and the PLO in general was that it was a nationalist alliance, not a working class organization. It received funds from the pro-US Arab dictators and refused to take a stand against them. The disastrous result came about in Jordan, where the PLO had its strongest base. The Palestinian refugees were 70% of Jordan's population, refugees from the Nakba, and supported the PLO against Jordan's King Hussein, an ally of the US capitalists. Arafat refused to mobilize against Hussein, who was then able to attack the PLO in Black September 1970. Hussein's army killed hundreds of Palestinian militants, and the weakened PLO was transferred from Jordan to Lebanon. In 1973, Egypt, Syria, and other Arab states, armed by the USSR, which had by then turned against Israel, attacked Israel. Israel was able to win the war thanks to a huge airlift of weapons from the US. After this major Cold War victory against the Soviet Union, military aid from the US to Israel increased significantly. The US then launched the so-called peace process, which has since been a cover for expanding Zionist occupation. In 1974, Arafat agreed to move towards a two-state solution, accepting the logic of the UN partition of 47. The PLO sold out not because Arafat lost his youthful radical edge, but because this is the fate of nationalist organizations under capitalism. The same thing happened to the more radical Palestinian left organizations that fought alongside the PLO in Jordan, which called themselves socialists, but allied with the Soviet Union, and as a consequence, with pro-Soviet states in the Middle East, like the Assad regime in Syria. In the wake of the dual defeat of nationalist and Stalinist organizations, Islamic organizations expanded instead. This dynamic is not unique to Palestine and repeated itself throughout the Middle East and North Africa. In 1978 and 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in order to crush the PLO and the Palestinian left. Hundreds of thousands of people in Lebanon were displaced. The Islamic militant group Hezbollah was formed in Lebanon in response to the attack. From the 1970s, Israel has become the world expert on counterinsurgency and border control, supplying weapons and training to many repressive regimes. The Israeli military complex is a huge part of the Israeli economy due to these exports, and that is the main reason for US support of the occupation of Palestine. The Israeli lobby that we always hear about is just a political expression of this economic relationship. Israel trained the military of the Shah of Iran. It supplied weapons and training to the military dictatorships that crushed the workers and farmers movements throughout Latin America, costing millions of lives. In El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Chile, Paraguay, and Argentina. It did the same with the South African apartheid regime, as well as in Zimbabwe. In the US, hundreds of police and border control forces like ICE are trained by the Israeli military. Israeli surveillance tech is used across the US-Mexico border. Since Israel is constantly at war with the Palestinians, it's a testing ground for new military tech that is then used all over the world. It is in this context that the US military aid of $3.8 billion a year must be understood. That's a big number, but it's just a dividend for what the US receives from Israel. In 1987, the first intifada, which means uprising or shaking off, broke out. It was a popular uprising of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians using stones, barricades, and improvised weapons against Israeli military forces. It also involved mass demonstrations, strikes, and freedom schools because Israel shut down the Arab schools. Israeli forces killed over 1,000 Palestinians in putting down the intifada. In 1988, the Hamas was formed. Their charter states, "There is no solution to the Palestinian problem except by jihad, holy struggle. The initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are a waste of time." The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 cleared the way for US capitalists to thoroughly dominate the region. The US invaded Iraq and initiated the Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO under Arafat. The PLO recognized the state of Israel, and the so-called peace process provided a cover and distraction for the further expansion of settlements in the West Bank, which, as you can see in this graph, did not slow down at all during or after the Oslo Accords. The Accords also established the Palestinian Authority, or sometimes it's called the Palestinian National Authority, to police the Palestinians in the West Bank on Israel's behalf. In 93 and 96, Israel attacked Lebanon again to drive out Hezbollah, which was shooting rockets into Israel. Hundreds of Lebanese civilians were killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. In 2000, the Second Intifada broke out. Once again, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians opposed the Israeli military. Israel ramped up its war against the Palestinians with the help of the PLO. In 2001, the September 11 attacks provided the US the opportunity to launch the so-called War on Terror with the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. The PLO declared itself a partner of the US in its war against terrorism and even shot Palestinians who protested the war in Afghanistan. Israel built a 470-mile wall through the West Bank, separating the Palestinian towns from the many Jewish settlements. In 2006, Israel invaded Lebanon again. This is the Second Lebanon War, as it's called, to attack the Hezbollah. The war killed over 1,000 Lebanese people and displaced 1 million people. In Gaza, the Hamas scored an electoral victory against Fatah. So now Hamas controls Gaza, and Fatah still controls the West Bank. In 2005, Israel removed its settlements from the Gaza Strip and built a wall around Gaza. This blockade tightened in 2007, and Gaza effectively became the largest open-air prison in the world. In December 2008, Israel launched a 3-week assault on Gaza, killing over 1,000 Palestinians. In 2014, another 7-week assault killed over 2,000 Palestinians. The most recent attack has already claimed 240 lives. Israel repeatedly targets facilities to demoralize the Palestinians and deprive them of basic necessities. In 2012, for example, Israel bombed Gaza's soccer field. This time around, Israel bombed a COVID testing center, schools, clinics and hospitals, water supply systems, media offices, bookstores, and even an ice cream factory. The war on Gaza and the West Bank is coupled with an economic war. Israel destroys the local Palestinian economies in Gaza and the West Bank and floods their market with Israeli products. Israel uses Palestinian military collaborators as importers and distributors of these goods, consolidating a Palestinian capitalist class loyal to Israel. These are the current demographics of Palestine. The state of Israel has 6.8 million Jews, all of whom are citizens, of course. Any Jew can become a citizen. It's called the right of return. You can just move there and get a citizenship. 1.8 Palestinian Arabs with Israeli citizenship, who on paper are equal to the Jews, but in practice, second-class citizens. There are 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, no citizenship, under siege, periodically bombed, etc. The West Bank and East Jerusalem has 2.7 million Palestinians, also no rights, walled in, and 600,000 Jewish settlers. And the descendants of the Palestinian refugees of the Nakba now number 5.1 million in other countries, that is. We often hear a simple representation of this conflict as one between Israelis and Palestinians. The clash reality is actually more complicated than that. The Palestinians, as we've seen, have their own little ruling class of millionaires who keep the Palestinian working class in check and living in poverty. Above that, Israel has its own ruling class of billionaires who benefit from the occupation. In turn, they're just the glove to the hand of the US capitalists who use the entire Zionist state as a weapon to keep exploiting the workers of the Middle East and North Africa. What we can see from all this is that to really understand this conflict, we have to zoom out and look beyond Palestine and Israel to the global capitalist economy. This is a map of US military bases around the world, and you can see the concentration in the Middle East. For Zionists, the state of Israel was supposed to be a solution to anti-Semitism and a safe haven for the Jewish people. Instead, Zionism is doing the opposite. Anti-Semitism has been increasing all over the world as a result of the humanitarian crisis, the violent ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. Israel is not about protecting anyone but the capitalists. It's an outpost of imperialism in the Middle East, the watchdog of the US ruling class. A solution to the conflict can only be achieved by removing its cause, Zionism, which itself is a critical branch of the capitalist system. This doesn't mean that the Palestinians must wait and be murdered and dispossessed until a socialist revolution. The road to revolution is paved with smaller struggles. We should fight for removing the blockade on Gaza, rebuilding Palestinian homes, removing the settlements from the West Bank, and granting civil rights to the Palestinian people, including the right to return to their homes and land. But the struggle of the Palestinians is inseparable from that of the millions of Arabs and other peoples of the region who are exploited, murdered, and tortured by dictators supported by the US ruling class. And even further, in this global economy, the struggle of the workers of the Middle East is tied to that of the workers of all countries. To make a slight adaptation of Trotsky's words from 1940 that I quoted earlier, never was it so clear as it is today that the solution to the crisis in Palestine is bound up inseparably with the overthrow of the capitalist system.